bringing veteran divisions that had conquered Singapore and the Dutch East Indies. This would not be another poorly coordinated night attack. The Japanese were preparing a methodical offensive designed to crush American resistance once and for all. The bombardment began at midnight on October 24, 1942. Japanese destroyers, cruisers, and battleships poured thousands of shells into the marine perimeter, turning Henderson Field into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. Marines huddled in their foxholes as the earth shook beneath them, praying that their hastily constructed bunkers would withstand the concentrated fury of naval gunfire. Historical records from the Naval War College, as documented in official after-action reports, indicate that this bombardment was among the most intense of the Pacific War. Over 1,400 shells of various calibers struck the American positions in less than 2 hours, destroying aircraft, ammunition dumps, and communication lines. When the barrage finally lifted, the Marines emerged to find their carefully prepared defenses in ruins, but the real attack was just beginning. Through the smoke and cordite haze came the sound that every Marine on Guadalcanal had learned to fear: thousands of Japanese soldiers moving through the jungle, their equipment clanking softly as they maneuvered into assault positions. Flares burst overhead, revealing wave after wave of Imperial Army troops advancing toward the Marine lines with bayonets fixed and rifles ready. The fighting that followed was unlike anything in American military experience. Japanese soldiers threw themselves against Marine positions with suicidal fury, accepting enormous casualties to breach the perimeter at any cost. Hand-to-hand combat raged in foxholes and bunkers, Americans and Japanese soldiers fighting with bayonets, knives, and bare hands in the suffocating darkness of the jungle night. Sergeant Basillone's position became the center of a maelstrom of violence that would earn him the Medal of Honor. His machine guns cut down attacking Japanese soldiers by the dozen, but still they came, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades to reach the American lines. When his ammunition ran low, Basillone crawled through enemy fire to retrieve more belts, returning to his gun to continue the deadly harvest. As dawn approached, the jungle fell silent except for the moans of wounded men and the distant sound of Japanese forces withdrawing. The Marines had held but barely. Henderson Field was still in American hands, but at a cost that made even veteran officers question whether they could survive another such assault. The morning of October 26, 1942, found the Marines of Henderson Field bloodied but unbroken, their positions scarred by the previous night's savage fighting. Major General Vandegrift walked among his men, noting the hollow-eyed exhaustion that marked every face. They had survived the worst the Japanese could throw at them, but everyone understood that the enemy would be back with even greater force. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Japanese reinforcements continued to arrive via the Tokyo Express, while American supply ships struggled to reach Guadalcanal during daylight hours. The Marines were fighting on short rations, limited ammunition, and medical supplies that dwindled. With each casualty, malaria, dysentery, and tropical diseases were taking almost as heavy a toll as enemy action. Captain Joe Foss led his Marine fighter squadron in daily battles over Henderson Field, his Wildcat fighters engaging Japanese Zeros in aerial combat that determined whether American ground forces would have air support or face unopposed bombing attacks. The pilots lived in constant tension, knowing that each mission might be their last and that the survival of their fellow Marines depended on their ability to maintain air superiority over the contested island. The Japanese had established their own defensive positions in the jungle surrounding the American perimeter, creating a deadly no-man's land where patrols from both sides clashed in brief, violent encounters. Every water source, every ridge line, every approach to Henderson Field became a battlefield, where small units fought for tactical advantages that might prove decisive in the larger struggle. Lieutenant Colonel Puller received orders to take his battalion into the jungle south of Henderson Field, where Japanese forces were massing for another major assault. The mission was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution: locate and destroy enemy concentrations before they could launch coordinated attacks on the airfield. What followed became known as the Battle for Hell's Corner, named for a jungle clearing where the fighting reached unprecedented intensity. Moving through the dense vegetation was like entering an alien world where normal military tactics meant nothing. Visibility was limited to a few yards in any direction. Communication between units was nearly impossible, and the enemy could be anywhere. Japanese snipers tied themselves into treetops, picking off Marines with surgical precision before disappearing into the green hell of the canopy. According to declassified Marine Corps' historical documents, the fighting in Hell's Corner represented jungle warfare at its most primitive and deadly. Units became separated in the maze of vegetation, fighting individual battles against enemies they could hear but rarely see. The sound of gunfire echoed strangely through the jungle, making it impossible to determine the direction of threats or the location of friendly forces. Private First Class Leckie found himself separated from his squad during one such patrol. Crouched behind a fallen log while Japanese soldiers moved through the jungle around him. The psychological pressure was enormous. Every sound could mean discovery and death. Every moment of silence might precede a deadly ambush. Marines learned to fight with all their senses, relying on smell, sound, and instinct to survive encounters. Where visual contact with the enemy might last only seconds, the jungle itself became a weapon in this fight. Booby traps fashioned from grenades and tripwires turned innocent-looking paths into death sentences. Japanese soldiers would hide in caves and bunkers carved into the coral ridges, emerging to attack Marine patrols before disappearing again into the earth. Disease-carrying insects, poisonous snakes, and contaminated water sources killed as efficiently as enemy bullets. By the end of October, both sides were reaching the limits of human endurance. The Marines had held Henderson Field through weeks of constant attack, but their strength was ebbing with each passing day. Japanese forces, despite enormous casualties, continued to receive reinforcements and remained determined to drive the Americans from Guadalcanal. The decisive phase of the campaign was approaching, and everyone understood that the next major battle might determine the fate of the entire Pacific War. November 13th, 1942, began like any other day on Guadalcanal, with Marine pilots preparing their aircraft for another round of combat missions and ground troops manning their defensive positions around Henderson Field. But 50 miles to the north, a massive Japanese naval force was steaming toward the island, intent on delivering the knockout blow that would finally drive American forces from the Solomon Islands. Admiral William Boole Halsey had replaced Admiral Robert Gormley as commander of South Pacific forces, bringing new aggressive tactics and a determination to hold Guadalcanal at any cost. His ships were already moving to intercept the Japanese fleet, setting up what would become one of the most crucial naval battles in American history. The Marines on Guadalcanal could only listen to radio reports and watch for the flashes of gunfire on the distant horizon. The first phase of the naval Battle of Guadalcanal erupted in the early morning hours as American and Japanese warships engaged in a savage nighttime gun battle that turned the waters around Savo Island into a blazing inferno. From their positions on Henderson Field, Marines could see the orange flashes of naval gunfire reflecting off the clouds, followed by the distant rumble of explosions that shook the ground beneath their feet. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan led his task force directly into the Japanese battle line, accepting enormous risks to prevent enemy battleships from bombarding Henderson Field. The American ships were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought with desperate courage, knowing that the survival of the Marine garrison depended on their ability to turn back the Japanese assault. The jungle screamed with the whine of incoming artillery shells as Private First Class Robert Leckie pressed his face into the muddy coral of Henderson Field. It was August 7th, 1942, and the first American offensive in the Furhi Pacific had just begun with all the fury of a tropical hurricane. Around him, thousands of United States Marines from the 1st Marine Division crouched in their landing craft, hearts pounding as they approached the seemingly peaceful shores of Guadalcanal. Major General Alexander Vandegrift stood on the bridge of the transport ship Macaulay, his weathered face etched with the weight of command. Through his binoculars, he could see the dense green canopy of the Solomon Islands stretching endlessly inland. Intelligence reports suggested the Japanese had been constructing an airfield on this godforsaken piece of jungle, a strategic position that could control the sea lanes to Australia. If the Empire of Japan completed that airfield, it would spell disaster for Allied forces in the Pacific. The Marines had trained for this moment in the sweltering heat of New Zealand, but nothing could have prepared them for what awaited on Guadalcanal. As the first wave of Higgins boats approached Red Beach, the silence was almost more terrifying than enemy fire would have been. Where were the Japanese defenders? The Marines had expected a fierce battle on the beaches, but instead found only scattered resistance. Sergeant John Bassell, who would later become a legend, led his machine gun section through the knee-deep surf and onto the black volcanic sand. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as his men established their first defensive positions. Behind them, more waves of Marines poured ashore, along with vital supplies, ammunition, and the components that would transform this hostile jungle into America's first foothold in the Japanese-controlled Pacific, according to historical accounts. Documented by military historians, the initial landing caught Japanese forces completely off guard. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki and his garrison had not expected such a massive American assault, having grown complacent after months of unopposed construction work on what they called their unsinkable aircraft carrier. By nightfall on that first day, over 10,000 Marines had established a beachhead nearly 6 miles wide. They had captured the partially completed airfield, which they immediately renamed Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. But as darkness fell over the jungle, every Marine knew that the real fight was just beginning. The humid tropical air carried strange sounds, the chattering of exotic birds, the rustling of unseen creatures, and somewhere in the distance, the ominous sound of enemy movement. Japanese forces were regrouping, and Imperial Navy ships were already steaming toward Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. What the Marines had accomplished in daylight would mean nothing if they couldn't hold their ground through the long, terrifying nights ahead. As Private Leckie cleaned his rifle in the fading light, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had just walked into a trap. The jungle seemed alive with malevolent intent, and every shadow could conceal an enemy soldier preparing to strike. The battle for Guadalcanal had begun, but the Marines were about to discover that taking the island was only the first step in what would become 6 months of the most brutal fighting in Pacific War history. The attack came at 0300 hours on August 19, 1942, announced by the distinctive crack of Japanese Arisaka rifles and the terrible shriek of banzai charges echoing through the jungle darkness. Colonel Ichiki had returned with reinforcements, convinced that a swift night assault would drive the Americans back into the sea. He was catastrophically wrong. Sergeant Bassilone's machine gun team was positioned along the Tanaru River when the first wave of Japanese soldiers emerged from the tree line like ghosts. The Marines had spent days preparing their defensive positions, creating interlocking fields of fire that would channel any attack into a killing zone. As flares burst overhead, illuminating the battlefield in harsh white light, Bassalon opened fire with his Browning M1917 machine gun. The sound was deafening, a mechanical roar that cut through the jungle night like a chainsaw. Through bamboo, Japanese soldiers, bayonets fixed and screaming their battle cries, charged directly into the concentrated firepower of the Marine positions. Bodies fell in waves, but still they came, driven by the fanatical courage that had carried the Imperial Army across the Pacific. Private Eugene Sledge, though he wouldn't arrive on Guadalcanal until later in the campaign, would later write about the psychological toll such night battles took on the Marines. The darkness played tricks on exhausted minds, turning every shadow into an enemy soldier, every jungle sound into the approach of death. Men aged years in single nights, their nerves stretched to the breaking point by the constant threat of sudden, violent death. Major General Vandegrift moved his command post closer to the front lines, refusing to lead from the safety of the rear. He understood that his Marines needed to see their commander sharing their dangers, facing the same deadly nights that had already claimed so many of their brothers. Radio communications crackled with reports from different sectors of the perimeter. Japanese probes here, full assaults there, the constant deadly game of thrust and parry that defined jungle warfare. As reported in military dispatches later, analyzed by the War Department, the Battle of the Tenaru River became a turning point in Marine Corps' tactical doctrine. The successful defense demonstrated that well-prepared positions, combined with superior firepower and discipline, could defeat even the most determined banzai charges. But the cost in human terms was staggering. Both sides lost hundreds of men in a single night of fighting. Dawn revealed the true horror of the battle. Bodies lay scattered across the riverbank, many floating face down in the muddy water. The jungle itself seemed wounded, with trees shattered by artillery fire and the very ground torn up by the fury of combat. Marine corpsmen moved carefully among the fallen, searching for wounded Americans while staying alert for Japanese soldiers who might be feigning death. The victory at Tenaru River gave the Marines confidence, but it also revealed the true nature of their enemy. These were not the demoralized conscripts they had expected to face, but elite Imperial Army troops willing to die rather than retreat. Every defensive position would have to be held with blood, every advance paid for in American lives. As the Marines buried their dead and tended their wounded, Japanese ships appeared on the horizon. The enemy was bringing reinforcements, more troops who would test the American perimeter with the same fanatical determination that had marked the Tenaru River assault. The siege of Guadalcanal was entering its deadliest phase, and every Marine knew that darker nights lay ahead. The Marines had given it a nickname as their growing fear, the Tokyo Express. Every few nights, Japanese destroyers would race down the slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands, bringing fresh troops and supplies to their forces on Guadalcanal, while bombarding American positions with devastating naval gunfire. The ships moved so fast that Allied aircraft couldn't intercept them, appearing and disappearing like deadly phantoms in the tropical darkness. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty-Puller had arrived with reinforcements from the 7th Marines, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he surveyed the battered perimeter around Henderson Field. The legendary Marine officer had fought in Nicaragua and Haiti, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the unique hell of Guadalcanal. Here, the enemy controlled the sea at night, making resupply a constant gamble and reinforcement a luxury the Americans could rarely afford. The airfield itself had become the focal point of the entire campaign. By day, Marine and Navy pilots flew missions from Henderson Field, attacking Japanese positions and intercepting enemy bombers. But at night, the field became a target for naval bombardment and infiltration attempts. Ground crews worked frantically to repair bomb craters and maintain aircraft, knowing that air superiority was the only thing preventing a complete Japanese victory. Corporal Mitchell Page positioned his machine gun section along a ridge that would later bear his name, preparing for what intelligence indicated would be the largest Japanese assault yet mounted. General Harukichi Hyakutake had arrived on Guadalcanal with the 17th Army. In the confusion of night combat, ships fired on targets they could barely see, sometimes hitting their own vessels in the chaos. The cost was staggering. Admiral Callahan died on the bridge of his flagship San Francisco, along with thousands of American sailors who gave their lives to protect the Marines on Guadalcanal. Japanese losses were equally severe, with several cruisers and destroyers sent to the bottom of what the Americans grimly nicknamed Iron Bottom Sound. But the immediate Japanese threat had been turned back, giving the Marines another reprieve from naval bombardment. Major General Vandegrift received reports of the naval battle with mixed emotions. American naval forces had prevented a catastrophic bombardment of Henderson Field, but at enormous cost in ships and lives. The strategic situation remained precarious. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were still receiving reinforcements, and another naval assault could come at any time. As documented in official Navy Department records, the naval battle of Guadalcanal marked a turning point in the Pacific War. For the first time, Japanese naval forces had been decisively defeated in a major engagement, demonstrating that American ships and sailors could match the Imperial Navy's legendary night fighting skills. But the victory came at a price that shocked military leaders in Washington. The Navy had lost more ships in a single night than in any previous battle of the war. The second phase of the naval battle occurred 2 nights later, when Japanese battleships Kirishima and Hiei attempted to complete their bombardment mission. This time, American forces were better prepared, with Admiral Willis Lee leading a task force of battleships, Washington and South Dakota, to intercept the enemy fleet. The resulting engagement was a classic battleship duel, with massive shells screaming across the dark waters at point-blank range. Private Leckie and his fellow Marines watched from their foxholes as the horizon erupted in sheets of flame. The sound was like thunder that never stopped, punctuated by explosions that sent columns of fire hundreds of feet into the air. They knew that their fate was being decided by sailors they would never meet, fighting a battle whose outcome would determine whether the Marines could continue to hold their precarious foothold on Guadalcanal. When dawn broke on November 15th, the waters around Guadalcanal were littered with the wreckage of both fleets. The Japanese had lost 2 battleships and several other vessels, while American forces had suffered severe damage but retained control of the sea around the island. Most importantly, Henderson Field remained in American hands, and Japanese plans for a decisive ground assault had been disrupted by the failure to destroy the airfield. Through naval bombardment, the naval battle of Guadalcanal had saved the Marine garrison, but everyone understood that the final test was yet to come. Japanese ground forces were still present in large numbers, and the struggle for the island would continue until one side or the other was completely defeated. December 1942 brought a different kind of warfare to Guadalcanal, as both American and Japanese commanders realized that the campaign had reached its decisive phase. The Marines had survived months of attacks, disease, and starvation, but they were no longer merely defending. They were preparing to go on the offensive and drive the remaining Japanese forces from the island once and for all. Major General Alexander Patch had arrived with the 25th Infantry Division and additional Marine reinforcements, bringing American strength on Guadalcanal to over 50,000 troops. The days of desperate last-stand defenses were over. Now the Americans possessed overwhelming superiority in men, equipment, and supplies. But the Japanese had used their months on the island to construct formidable defensive positions in the jungle highlands west of Henderson Field. Lieutenant Colonel Puller led his Marines in a series of probing attacks designed to locate and map Japanese defensive positions. What they found was a network of bunkers, caves, and fortified ridges that would have to be taken one by one in costly frontal assaults. The enemy had learned from their failed banzai charges and now fought from prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire and carefully planned withdrawal routes. The terrain itself favored the defenders. Steep ridges covered in dense jungle provided natural defensive positions that were nearly invisible until attackers were within grenade range. Japanese engineers had connected these positions with tunnels and communication trenches, allowing defenders to shift forces rapidly to counter American attacks. Every advance would cost American lives, paid in the bloody currency of jungle combat. Sergeant Bussalone, now wearing the Medal of Honor he had earned during the October battles, found himself training replacement Marines who arrived pale and nervous from the United States. The veteran NCO tried to prepare them for the unique horror of jungle fighting, but everyone knew that some lessons could only be learned through combat experience. The jungle would teach its own deadly curriculum to these young Americans. General Harukichi Hayakotake had received orders from Tokyo to hold Guadalcanal at all costs, but he was running out of men and supplies to carry out that mission. The Tokyo express runs had become increasingly dangerous as American air and naval forces gained strength, and Japanese troops on the island were reduced to near-starvation rations. Still, they prepared to fight to the death rather than surrender, in accordance with the warrior code that had sustained the Imperial Army throughout its conquest of the Pacific. According to classified intelligence reports later released by the Department of Defense, American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese communications, indicating that enemy commanders were considering withdrawal from Guadalcanal. But those same intercepts revealed that Japanese forces would conduct a fighting retreat, making the Americans pay in blood for every mile of jungle they advanced through. The final offensive began on January 10, 1943, with a massive artillery barrage that turned the suspected Japanese positions into a landscape from hell. Marine and Army artillery, supported by naval gunfire from offshore cruisers and destroyers, pounded the jungle for hours before the infantry advance began. But when the American troops moved forward, they discovered that many Japanese positions had survived the bombardment, protected by coral caves and reinforced bunkers. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, who had arrived with the latest reinforcements, experienced his first taste of combat during these final battles. The reality of jungle warfare shocked him, the difficulty of locating enemies who were masters of camouflage, the terror of advancing through terrain where every tree might conceal a sniper, and the psychological strain of fighting an enemy who preferred death to surrender. The Marines and soldiers advanced methodically, using flamethrowers and demolition charges to clear Japanese positions that could not be taken by conventional assault. The fighting was intimate and brutal, with Americans and Japanese soldiers often engaging at ranges measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. Grenades were thrown back and forth like deadly games of catch, and hand-to-hand combat occurred whenever the two sides came into close contact. As American forces pushed deeper into the Japanese defensive zone, they began to encounter evidence of their enemy's desperation. Japanese soldiers, starving and diseased, fought with the fury of men who knew they were dying. Some positions were defended to the last man, while others were abandoned as Japanese commanders began the process of evacuating their remaining forces from the island. By February 1, 1943, the sound of gunfire had finally faded from the jungles of Guadalcanal. The last organized Japanese resistance had been crushed, and the remnants of the once mighty 17th Army were evacuating under cover of darkness, leaving behind thousands of dead and the first major defeat in the Pacific War. For the Marines, who had endured 6 months of hell, the silence was almost more overwhelming than the constant combat had been. Major General Patch stood on the beach where the first Marines had landed more than 6 months earlier, watching as the final Japanese barges disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. The cost of victory had been staggering: over 7,000 American casualties, including 1,600 dead, not counting the thousands more who had been evacuated due to disease and combat fatigue. But they had accomplished something that many military experts had thought impossible. They had defeated the Japanese Army in a sustained ground campaign. The strategic implications of the Guadalcanal victory extended far beyond the Solomon Islands. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces had seized and held territory previously controlled by the Empire of Japan. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered, and the psychological impact on both sides would influence every subsequent battle in the Pacific War. More importantly, the campaign had demonstrated that American industrial capacity could sustain prolonged operations against a determined enemy. Henderson Field, which had been the focal point of so much fighting, was now expanded into a major air base that would support future operations throughout the Pacific. The Marines who had defended the airfield with their lives could take pride in knowing that their sacrifice had created a permanent American presence in the heart of Japanese-controlled territory. Pilots taking off from Henderson Field would carry the war directly to enemy strongholds throughout the Central Pacific. Captain Joe Foss, whose fighter squadron had played such a crucial role in maintaining air superiority over Guadalcanal, received the Medal of Honor for his 26 confirmed aerial victories. But he knew that his success had been built on the foundation of courage, displayed by thousands of Marines who had held the airfield against impossible odds. The pilots could only fly because ground crews and infantry had kept Henderson Field operational despite constant enemy attacks. The lessons learned on Guadalcanal would reshape American military doctrine for the remainder of the Pacific War. The importance of air-ground coordination, the effectiveness of concentrated firepower against banzai charges, and the crucial role of logistics in sustained operations all became fundamental principles that would guide future campaigns. But perhaps most importantly, the Marines had proven that American forces could match the Japanese in jungle fighting, given proper training and adequate support. According to post-war analysis conducted by the Army War College, the Guadalcanal campaign marked the beginning of Japan's strategic decline in the Pacific. The loss of experienced pilots, naval vessels, and elite ground troops could not be easily replaced, while American forces gained valuable combat experience and confidence that would serve them well in future battles. The initiative in the Pacific War had permanently shifted to the United States. Private First Class Leckie, along with thousands of other Marines, was eventually evacuated from Guadalcanal to recover from wounds, disease, and combat exhaustion. Many would never return to combat, their war ending in hospitals and rehabilitation centers far from the jungles where they had proved their courage. But their sacrifice had purchased something invaluable, the first step on the road to Tokyo. As the troopships carried the survivors away from Guadalcanal, many Marines looked back at the island that had been their home, battlefield, and hell. For so many months, the jungle was already beginning to reclaim the scars of war, growing over the foxholes, bunkers, and graves that marked the sites of desperate battles. But the memory of what had been accomplished there would live forever in Marine Corps' history, the place where ordinary Americans had held their ground against a fanatical enemy and won the first decisive victory of the Pacific War. The Battle of Guadalcanal was over, but its legacy would inspire American forces throughout the long campaign that would eventually end in Tokyo Bay. The Marines had proved that no enemy, no matter how determined or experienced, could stand against American courage when backed by American industry and American resolve. The road to victory in the Pacific had begun in the jungles of Guadalcanal, paved with the sacrifice of heroes who had refused to yield.